After 32 years and almost 900,000 miles on operations, HMS Illustrious is preparing to dock at Portsmouth for the final time. The last of the Invincible-class aircraft carriers, the ship known as Lusty has been involved in conflicts from the Gulf to Sierra Leone, but today is her last in active service. We're going to show you some live pictures of Illustrious coming in a moment or two. There she is, and joining me in the studio is Simon Newton to talk us through. It is, I guess, an emotional day for the crew. We're expecting crowds there to be on hand to welcome her home. It's a big day, isn't it, in her history?
It's a very big day for Portsmouth, big day for the Royal Navy. You can see there at the front end of the ship, up on the ski ramp there, that famous ski ramp that we all kind of know from those shots from the Falklands, really, of the Harriers taking off. Kind of emblematic of that era, that class of ship, the sailors there as it comes into Portsmouth for its final journey. As you say, it's the last of the Invincible class carriers. HMS Ark Royal and HMS Illustrious have already been sent to a Turkish scrapyard. They are no more, and this is its final voyage. It's I think 22,000 tons of warship, been in service since the late 70s, really. Obviously, it was a ship that was rushed into service, if you're old enough like me to remember the Falklands War. For that occasion, it didn't actually make it. It was actually commissioned en route to the Falkland Islands at the time, while it was taking on stores, because it actually didn't have time to do that. But then it played a major part once it had reached the Falklands, after the Falklands War had been won, of acting as a sort of air base, if you like, off the Falkland Islands while Port Stanley was repaired. But as you say, really a very big moment for the Royal Navy. This is the start of a new era in terms of aircraft carriers. We obviously have HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales coming on in the future, which were much bigger than this ship itself.
I guess, as you say, emblematic almost of different eras in history and different eras of the military. You mentioned the Falklands, used in a very different way in more recent years, though. Yes,
it really has been a disaster relief ship in some sort of ways, and a policing ship in others. It was obviously in the 90s. It was used to enforce the no-fly zone over Bosnia, and in 2000 it was involved in the task force policing and trying to bring peace and stability to Sierra Leone, obviously, in which the British Army was involved. And then we had 9/11, of course, when everything changed and it was sent to the Gulf during that period of time. 2006 it was involved in helping to evacuate British citizens from Beirut, when we had the previous hostilities there between Israel and Lebanon, and then more recently, as you mentioned, really, it's been involved just last year in the Philippines, helping in the disaster relief around Typhoon Haiyan. So it has had a very varied career in a sense, and I imagine many current serving Royal Navy personnel and many who have served on it in the past will have perhaps a tear in their eye today as it makes its final voyage.
And of course, no Harriers on board anymore. As you mentioned, those iconic shots of them taking off from the front.
Yes.
But Merlin helicopters more recently used. You've been on board.
Yes, I went on board.
Give us a sense.
I was on Illustrious. In fact, just last month. It was taking part in an exercise just off the coast of Cornwall when I joined it, and it was quite a significant moment because it was the first time that they had 9 Merlin helicopters from Culdrose actually on board, acting as a group. They were taking part in an anti-submarine warfare exercise out in the Atlantic. It was called Exercise Deep Blue, and this involved submarines, not just British submarines but Dutch submarines and French ones, and essentially they were going out there as a carrier, a small carrier fleet, if you like, and these Merlin's job was to protect the carrier fleet. So they had these aircraft in the air. The Royal Navy call it a ripple, which is essentially having 3 aircraft in the air all the time, 24 hours a day. The crews basically just eat, sleep, fly for quite a long period of time. It was quite something to see them doing that, and they go out, they ping as they would normally do during exercise, looking for submarines out there, and essentially simulate attacks on those. And the Merlin, if you talk to the pilots of the Merlins who are actually on board this aircraft carrier, will say it's the best anti-submarine warfare aircraft in the world. But as you say, the change, if you like, from the Harriers that we know from those shots of the Falklands was 2010. That's when the Harrier aircraft were officially retired from service, and that was also the year in which we had the defence cuts, which ended the career of this aircraft carrier, really.
Which begs the question, what's going to happen to her now?
Very good question. There's been lots of talk about it for several years. The MOD are saying they wanted to keep it as a symbol for future generations. There's been some wild ideas. One about turning it into almost a luxury cruise liner, having these huge sails where you can see the towers at the moment. They would have these huge sails with restaurants in there and conference centres and various other somewhat crazy ideas, I would imagine. And then you could also use it as a disaster relief ship. Another plan was to maybe make it into what they called a Commonwealth yacht, where it would sail around the Commonwealth, acting as an emblem for the Commonwealth in trade missions, etc. But it's more realistic that it's probably going to end up being birthed in Portsmouth, perhaps, as a floating monument, if you like, to that class of aircraft carrier. I don't know if you've ever been to San Diego in America, where they have one. It's a huge attraction for people to go and have a look around, and I imagine this would also be a very big draw for people to come to Portsmouth. Which
is absolutely much more an attractive option than, I guess, one of the alternatives, which would be to strip her down. Nobody really wants to see that happen.
No, as I say, her two predecessors, that has happened. They have ended up being scrapped. There seems to be a will, whether there's the money, I suppose, is the other question, but there seems to be a will, at least, to try and preserve this one as an emblem of its era.
Give us a sense, as you say, from being on board, what is it like to live on, to work on? What's the crew relationship like?
I'm 6'3" tall, so it's very small.
Easier for me then.
Yeah, it just felt quite cramped. I'm not obviously on board ships that often, but it does feel quite small walking around it. I mean, the new aircraft carriers are so big that the sailors on board there actually have an app which they have on their phones to actually get them around these things. This isn't quite so big. I mean, in terms of tonnage, for instance, this is 22,000 tonnes. The new QE class submarines are 65,000 tonnes, 3 times the size. But when you are on this, it does feel very big indeed. And just, navigating your way around it inside, it does feel quite a cramped atmosphere. And I can imagine if you were in a war scenario, a fighting scenario, it would be a very intense place to be.
As HMS Illustrious gets closer to docking, of course, we're starting to see some of the crowds that have come out to welcome her and the crew home, which I guess emphasises in many ways that the moments of history that we are kind of seeing, that people have come out in the numbers.
And again, we've talked a lot about the Falklands, obviously, because this is of that era, but that's obviously the famous shot we remember of the aircraft carriers returning from the Falklands War, and people on the Round Tower in Portsmouth and on in the old port there in the old harbour area, waving her in. I imagine there will be lots of people watching her as she comes in. It is quite a sight, particularly obviously it's a lovely day for it as well, which I guess helps a great deal.
And I guess normally in this situation, family and friends on the dockside, it's a scene of much jubilation as they're welcoming their loved ones home. Today it's tinged with a great deal of sadness as well.
Yes, and I think there will be, you're right, a great deal of sadness, and the crew on board, I imagine they will be, whether they already know where else they're going to be deployed, I'm not entirely sure, but they will obviously be, whether they're going to go onto the new aircraft carriers as and when they come into service. The normal form when you have these homecomings, if you like, is that they will come off, meet their families, and then the families are allowed to go on board and have a look around. So I imagine maybe more than normal numbers of families will want to go on here today and have a look around for a last time.
And take their pictures and grab the souvenir photographs to take home and to remember the day. Just to remind people who might just be tuning in, the Royal Navy's helicopter carrier now, HMS Illustrious, returning to Portsmouth for the final time. Crowds, as we saw in those pictures, lining the dockside to welcome her home after 32 years of dedicated and very impressive and memorable service. Simon Newton in the studio watching it with me. And again, just recap for our viewers who might just be joining in or tuning in, the sense of history of today, quite what history goes before us in terms of Illustrious's long career.
Yes, I think she is the 5th HMS Illustrious in the history of the Royal Navy. So the name goes back a great long way. She was launched by Princess Margaret back in 1978. She was built on the Tyne at Swan Hunter, obviously the name we all associate with the Royal Navy. And as I say, she was heading for the Falklands to engage in that war. That war had ended by that time, but there was no time to actually give her the formal commissioning that we know would normally take place. So that actually happened en route to the Falklands Islands, and she has played this very diverse wartime role in a sense in that scenario, the Falklands, and a peacekeeping role and a humanitarian role around the world. So she has provided a great service to this nation.
Well, let's just pause for a moment and just have a watch, and maybe a listen if we can, to see what kind of reception. I'm not sure if we can hear the sound from dockside. Let's have a listen and see if we can hear any kind of reception in Portsmouth for HMS Illustrious. Well, as we start to see some of the welcome as well, a little bit of pageantry involved in today, that little sort of sense of history as HMS Illustrious returns to Portsmouth for the final time, as we've been saying. We will, of course, be covering it throughout the afternoon here on Forces TV as the crew disembarks, and we'll be chatting to them and hopefully some of the friends and family there too. Any sense, Simon, of what happens now? I mean, obviously it docks, people get off. What happens then? It just...
Well, normally in this situation they would go into a period of maintenance for several months before they are redeployed somewhere. So, even up to a year, for instance, on some of the Type 42 destroyers that we are now in the current Royal Navy, obviously. In this case, I'm not entirely sure what happens in terms of, because we don't know yet about the formal decision. There has been a sort of tendering process, if you like, going on between the MOD have invited private companies, charities and trusts to actually come forward with ideas for what could happen to her next. But it's all because it's obviously commercial, some of it at least, it's they're very tight-lipped about exactly what's going to happen to her. So we don't know what the score is, whether she will sail off to some other port. I mean, there's been talk apparent, for instance, not just Portsmouth, Hull has been another place that's perhaps bid to have her as a floating museum in there in that city as well. So we don't quite know what's going to happen yet.
And I guess as a somebody with an eye on the military, somebody who'd like to go and have a look at it, that sort of floating museum idea, whilst others might sort of balk at the kind of it not being used in active service anymore, it would be fascinating to go and have a good look around. You've been on it. I haven't had the chance yet. It would be great.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I have to say, when you go on it, although it's an aircraft carrier, it doesn't feel. I mean, when you think about Harriers flying off its flight deck, it doesn't feel huge in that respect. So, you see that the takeoff area that a Harrier would have to get up that ski jump, that famous ski jump and off. It's not a huge, expansive area. You can see how skillful the pilots have to be to do that, and how what a wonderful aircraft the Harrier was to actually take off the Sea Harrier in particular. We all remember from that, I think it was Brian Hanrahan, wasn't it, the famous phrase about counting them all out, counting them all back.
Them all back in again.
So it doesn't feel like a huge area, but when you go down into the bowels of Illustrious, you go down on the lift, which is, by comparison to the new aircraft carrier, is very slow. I understand it's quite a gradual process, whereas the new aircraft carrier can lift the F-35 when it arrives onto the deck very, very quickly indeed. So yes, it's a fascinating thing to go and look around, and I imagine, as I say, if it is berthed in Portsmouth or in Hull or anywhere else, it'll be a huge attraction for visitors.
And you can just see on the right-hand side there, the photographer's not taking pictures at the minute, but they've been taking lots. It just gives you some sort of sense of what an occasion this is. Simon, thank you very much for talking us through that. Really interesting stuff. But for the time being, after 32 years of dedicated service and almost 900,000 miles, HMS Illustrious has docked for the final time in Portsmouth.